Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here to talk about American strategy and American policy towards the Eastern Mediterranean. And it's quite a hard task given that Michael Doran yesterday said quite a lot of what I would have liked to have said. So I'm going to have to try and come up with some variation, which I hope I'll be able to do. What I want you to think about to begin with is whether you are a 38er or a 68er. What do I mean by that? 38ers. 38ers are people who think in terms of 1938, in terms of Munich, in terms of the dangers of allowing a power vacuum to develop, in terms of the dangers of allowing non-democratic, authoritarian, extremist, irrational states to do what they like. In Israel, there are rather a lot of 38ers. Then there are the 68ers, and they think about the Tet Offensive, Vietnam, and they worry what happens when you pour hundreds of thousands of troops into a conflict which you cannot win politically, no matter how many battles you win on the battlefield, because you cannot achieve your political objectives. And one thing I learned from a year in Washington is that no matter how many rational discussions you have about the pros and cons of intervention or non-intervention in the Middle East, confronting or reaching an agreement with Iran, in the end, one comes down to metaphors. And what tips the balance? And for many people of the older generation, it's 38ers and 68ers. And for younger people, it's 9/11 or the Iraq War. And I want you to think about that when we think about the debates that are going on in America about American grand strategy and how America should relate to what's going on now in the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean. But the first thing I want to talk about is American capabilities, okay? First thing that matters is how strong are you? What can you actually do? And then you have to decide what is your best strategy for doing that. Okay? The first thing to realize is, yes, it's true in relative terms that America is less powerful than it was when the Cold War ended. But in relative terms to world history of great powers, there has never been a larger differential between the strongest power and the remainder of the powers. In terms of sheer military capacity, in terms of global military reach, in terms of the economic and technological power base that you can bring to bear militarily, not just how rich people are, but your ability to translate that into military power. So the United States is more powerful than the next 5 or 6 countries put together militarily. A recent article by William Woolforth and Stephen Brooks that appeared in International Security, which is the leading journal of international strategic affairs in the US, claimed that, and I think rightly, that China is the only potential challenger, but the difficulty in translating potential into reality will mean that for a minimum of 30, 40 years, China can't catch up globally. That doesn't mean that China isn't a serious player. Just to give you some sense, the United States has 10 aircraft carriers. Another couple of countries have 2. India and a European country, I think it's Italy, has 2 aircraft carriers. Other countries only have 1. And the Russian ones apparently need to be accompanied by tugs because, you know, they tend to go wrong, right? It tends to go wrong. So you have to take this into account. Then sheer capabilities, the US, despite its relative decline, it's all relative, it's still overwhelmingly powerful. Now that doesn't mean it can do everything it likes, right? The Tet Offensive, you can win on the battlefield and lose what you can't obtain your political objective. But one has to recognize the US has the power. What does it mean in this region? Well, in this region, it also has less power than it had, but it is still potentially dominant. Less power because its alliances, as Ephraim mentioned yesterday, are weaker, afraid. It had the 3 big powers, right? Israel, Egypt, and Turkey. Egypt is got a lot of internal things going on. Turkey is going through a period of not really knowing whose side it's on. and Israel remains. Okay, so it's still got Israel. So it has less power, but we always need to focus out and say, but it's still capable of dominating. So it's really a question, therefore, of will and strategy, which is why I started with, are you a 38er or are you a 68er? Now, one thing affecting American strategy is its political culture, its value system. Americans are liberal through and through. Liberal with a small L, not liberal versus conservative, supporters of democracy. There is no aristocratic right or communist left in America as there was in Europe. The balance is completely different. Everyone is a small L liberal. There's never been a major anti-democratic movement or anti-liberal movement in America, and there has, of course, been in Europe. What does that mean? It means that Americans have a predisposition to support military intervention for liberal reasons or not at all. Okay? Either it's absolutely defending America, self-defense that is absolutely clear. The Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor, right? Or Al-Qaeda blows up the World Trade Center. But other than that, their whole way of talking about intervention is it's got to be liberal. You've got to be making the world better. You've got to be extending the liberal economic space, free trade, encouraging democratization, human rights, etc. And so Colin Dweck, who writes a lot about American grand strategy from George Mason University in America, said the following: a distinctly liberal pattern of oscillation in foreign policy comes out of this liberal political culture. First is intervention, which turns into a crusade, followed by disappointment, then sullen isolation, which leaves the United States unprepared for the next challenge. Okay? First World War, the war to end all wars. Wilson's 14 points, we're going to bring democracy, we're going to bring self-determination. We don't get it, we get isolation, we get the collapse of the balance of power in Europe, we get the Second World War. We get America crusading to save Western Europe, to build a liberal democratic order. Then we get Vietnam, we get the retreat, we get 9/11 and the attack, we come back, we get the Iraq war, and we go home. We couldn't democratize Iraq, okay? So now we're unprepared to confront the next challenge, which I would say is Iran. Okay, so this is a tendency. It's not a policy, it's not conscious, but it's a tendency in American politics which exists. What about the different approaches? Well, if you follow the American presidential election debates, what you see is a lot of gut instinct and rather less thought out policy, but gut instincts count. And what you have are basically two divides. You have one divide, which is how assertive or how forceful should America be in its foreign policy, or how defensive, cautious, and diplomatic. And we can say that the Republicans are at one end, yeah, and the Democrats are at the other end, and Hillary's more in the middle, and Bernie's more on the left, and Trump and Cruz are more on the right, and Rubio and Bush are more in the middle, right? Okay, so that bit, yeah, everyone gets. Perhaps what isn't so well understood is there's another divide, which is how much should the United States underwrite world order? You know, there's a liberal world order founded by the United States after the Second World War. All the international institutions, free trade, World Bank, IMF, all of that, and NATO and all these institutions. Should the US underwrite that? Or that's what I call an internationalist position, and that's Rubio and Bush from the Republicans and Clinton from the Democrats. Or should it be more nationalist? Right? Which is Bernie Sanders. Just look after ourselves. In British history, you call them little Englanders or little Americans, right? We've got to focus on domestic reform if you're Bernie Sanders, or if you're Ted Cruz or Trump, we'll intervene if they threaten us with super force, but we're not there to make the world a better place. We're not there to be the world policeman. We're just there to look after America in a narrower sense. And this comes to affect the Eastern Mediterranean when we look at Syria. Okay? So Obama and Bernie and Cruz and Trump, as Michael said yesterday, they disagree about what you do in response to a threat. One says talk, one says whack them. But they agree we don't have to underwrite the order. So they've all been against no-fly zones in Syria, Whereas the Rubios, the Bushes, and the Clintons have spoken in favor of no-fly zones in Syria. And just to give you some idea, no-fly zone means you don't need boots on the ground, but it would mean, if this had been done a year ago, right, that the Russians would not be able to bomb the non-ISIS opposition to Assad, because the Americans would be flying above them. America has clear supremacy in the air. Nobody's going to want to touch the Americans if they put the thing down to begin with. That would mean there would have been less refugee flight, right, because people would be safer. Okay? It wouldn't win the war, but it would prevent Assad and the Russians and the Iranians from gaining an upper hand through the air. And what with the Kurds on the ground, that could have been interesting. Okay? There's two ways of thinking about the Near East. Do you see it as a series of discrete problems, right? There's instability in Libya. There's instability in Egypt. There's problems in Syria. There's the Israelis and Hamas. There's the refugees. And all of them need to be dealt with on their own terms. Or do you see a big picture? The US is managing the global commons. It's a global power. It underwrites the whole system. And it has to provide that public good, and it has to protect it. Now, that doesn't mean it has to invade everywhere and do an Iraq war, right? It's not always about assertiveness. It's not always about using force, but it's about making sure that that order is there and leading and reassuring other powers, as Michael Doran said yesterday, bringing them together. Michael said, you know, it's either a rectangular table, that was Bush, you've got your friends and your enemies, or a round table. He said that Obama wanted to get them all around the table. I think Obama actually has an oval table. Sort of half wants to work with them and half wants to contain them. Okay? But the point is that it's a question of how you conceive it. Do you see these things as joined up, and therefore America has to underwrite and do stuff to underwrite this, or not? Okay? And how much money and resources are you willing to put into being the global policeman versus dealing with internal priorities, right? There are presidents who have done both, but it's difficult. Harry Truman was a progressive domestically. He spent the money internally, and he was quite hawkish against the Soviet Union externally, right? So, you know, that would be a model that doesn't exist in this election campaign. I happen to think it would be the winning ticket, but there isn't a candidate like that. Okay? Right. Now, the former NATO Supreme Commander in Europe, writing in Foreign Policy in 2013, said, look, America doesn't have a Mediterranean strategy, and it should have one. In other words, he was saying, these aren't problems that are not joined up. They are joined up, and we need to deal with it. And America, which dominates the world navally, has still the biggest naval force in the Mediterranean, the Sixth Fleet, but that has shrunk greatly since the end of the Cold War because there was nothing to deal with. There was no problem. And so the question is, what do you do to sort of deal with this issue? And what Obama has done is taken a policy of cautious retrenchment. Okay? He said, America's overstretched. We're spending too much money abroad. I want to spend it at home. Don't do stupid stuff, we'll say. Okay? That's his motto. So if you want to get Obama administration to do anything militarily, the weight of evidence is always to prove to them it's absolutely going to be perfect and work. Otherwise, they don't want to get bogged down. Okay? And we can see that this is what's happened across the Eastern Mediterranean with policy. A very high threshold for commitments. Now, that doesn't mean, you know, it's all relative. America still has huge numbers of forces in the Persian Gulf, yeah, and in the region, okay? But its willpower to assert that has gone down. And so, you know, if your power is made up not only of your capabilities, but the perception that you're willing to use them, its power has gone down because people think they can get away with lots of things because they think America won't act. Had America wanted to prevent the Syrians, the Russians and Iranians going in Syria, they could have done. They chose not to. So we saw in Egypt, in Libya, America leading from behind. You know, the emotional, ideological, liberal response, Gaddafi is a horrible dictator who's done terrible things. We need to get rid of him, right? Without a strategy of what actually you're going to have to do about all of this, right? And so we see chaos in Libya. But what do we see? Now we see American forces, they've assassinated the head of IS in Libya. There are some forces on the ground. They're being dragged back in a little bit against their will. Same thing in Syria. Stay out, there's no one to work with. All true. But the alternative, the alternative has proven very costly, right? An unprecedented number of refugees going into Europe, destabilizing the European Union, straining it, okay? Bringing in forces of the even more destabilizing, terrible humanitarian tragedy in Syria, much of which could have been limited without a huge cost. But it reminds me of Yes, Prime Minister, the British comedy show, which had the 5 stages of intervention. First, we say there's nothing that we can do. Then we say, well, maybe there is something we could do. Then we say, well, maybe there was something we could have done then, but now it's too late, right? That is what we've basically seen. Okay, so yes, America's got dragged back in. It's now got it's got people on the ground, forces on the ground in Iraq and Syria. They're doing some stuff, but they don't want to go for the big hit. And Egypt, right? You would think that Egypt, it's the most prestigious Arab state, the most populous Arab state. The administration, its focus in dealing with it, with the Morsi regime and with the Mubarak is that, okay, our liberal values say our allies should behave well because we're more responsible for our allies than our enemies. Okay? The consequences, though, of cutting off arms supply and cutting off aid to Sisi after the coup, which they're not allowed to call it a coup, otherwise it's a problem for American law, right? That the cutting off of those aid led Egypt to buy arms from other countries, including Russia. It did not affect their internal behavior. It did not make them treat the opposition better. It did not stop them killing the opposition. And so what do we see in March 2015? We start reselling arms to Egypt. We restart the strategic dialogue. We say we are willing to do maneuvers. We get dragged back in. Okay? Israel, Hamas, we don't go to Egypt. We go to a ceasefire to the Turks. We go for a ceasefire to Qatar. Yeah? But in the end, we get pulled back. We're not pressuring Israel to do much. We're backing Israeli security. We're going to up the strategic relationship with Israel. Turkey didn't prove to be much help. And again, we see this thing of hoping that you can withdraw somewhat and hope that Russia, Turkey, Iran will behave as rational, self-interested powers, and that will mean there's a minimal level of stability. And after all, what's the difference between our friends, the Saudis and the Egyptians in human rights terms, and those people? Right? It's just a power thing. That hasn't worked very well, right? It hasn't worked very well. In fact, it's failed. The reset with Putin, the attempt to get close with Erdogan, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, it's failed. And so they're pulling back reluctantly to their allies, but it's very reluctant, so we don't see a full-blooded turnaround and endorsement of the situation. What can they do going forward? What would be the right way? Well, I think America has to reassert its international leadership. It has to do that because without American leadership, the levels of stability that we take for granted will crumble. Had the Egyptian-Israeli peace collapsed, had the Muslim Brotherhood been able to stay in power longer, had they been able to get more of their way, the foundation of the Arab-Israeli peace, which is that Egypt and Israel get weapons from the US, they're the most powerful countries, there's no two-front war against Israel, so what's the point of a major war against Israel? That provides regional stability. If there's a crack in that, the whole thing collapses. Okay? In the 1930s, people say, oh, what was the problem? It was the rise of Hitler, it was British appeasement. A large part of the problem was that America wasn't there. If America had been there allied with Britain and France, right, which was one idea that was floated in 1919, then Hitler would not have had the ability to wreak havoc. Okay? So American leadership is critical, and one of the problems at the moment in the US in achieving that is that foreign policy has become very partisan, okay, between Republicans and Democrats, interventionist, assertive, all the rest of it. And it's very hard to articulate a policy which says, look, just because I'm an internationalist doesn't mean I think we should invade every country. right? We have to be clever about where we intervene, okay? But we have to intervene where the results will be beneficial and significant and not to make ourselves feel good. And there you have the Libya versus Syria dilemma. Syria was more difficult, right? Than Libya was easy, right? Comparative, militarily. Syria was always going to be more difficult, but it was always going to be more significant. For me, it's the same with Iran and Iraq. Iraq was easy, but it was unnecessary and at the end disastrous. Iran was always going to be much more difficult, but also much more significant. And I'll leave you on that note. Thank you very much.